My internet doesn't seem to be working.
Cooperating.
I'll keep trying.
Okay, no worries. Okay, well, it's great to have everybody here today. We'll get started. I know there was a lot of interest in this. I am a parent myself and have a 2-year-old and a 7-year-old. I've become a first grade teacher in addition to a delegate and lawyer, and it's been quite an adventure, but I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and especially our speakers. I'm really personally interested in presentation as well. And so my name is Delegate Brooke Learman. I represent with my teammates, Senator Bill Ferguson and Delegates Lou Clippinger and Robin Lewis, the 46th District in Baltimore City. And I'm really proud to be working in Baltimore City and representing us at the state level to implement and pass policies to help Marylanders move forward. So before we begin, I just want to make a few points about where we are today, why I'm hosting these webinars. So, you know, I've long believed that being a delegate is more than just about passing bills. It's also about connecting people to the resources that they need and being somebody who can be an advocate for individuals in our communities. And I fundamentally believe that government is all about reducing barriers to success, creating opportunity, and keeping our residents safe. And these days, trying to work really hard to keep them safe and healthy. So as we find ourselves in the midst of this public health and economic crisis, you know, we are in uncharted territory and everyone is hurting in some way. And so I'm delighted to be able to bring together people like the specialists we have today to help provide resources for people who are struggling in a variety of different ways. And I think we've had over 10 webinars now, and I'm excited to have another one tomorrow honoring our frontline workers on International Workers' Day. I'm looking forward to having webinars in the future on the digital divide, on environmental work, and more. So where are we today? Today we have over 20,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19 here in Maryland and over 985 people who've passed away. Governor Hogan, of course, has issued a stay-at-home directive. He has closed non-essential businesses, expanded telehealth services, and very recently, I think just yesterday, we saw that we're going to start mandating testing in our nursing homes and assisted living facilities. So why a webinar, why a briefing on supporting ourselves and our kids? Well, I'm hosting these to help keep all of you and your friends and communities up to date on the rapidly changing response to COVID and to provide a resource and help as we're all navigating this uncharted territory. Over the past few weeks, many of us have been at home with our kids, attempting to juggle telework, facilitate distance learning, entertaining kids, and cooking and cleaning and exercising, and also trying to follow the news on the latest guidance. And then we somehow try to manage a little bit of sleep every once in a while too. So I know that I found it challenging, and I think many of you, I'm sure, have found it challenging and overwhelming as well. You're not alone. There's a lot of strategies we can employ. And today I'm so delighted to have Dr. Hal Kronsberg, Dr. Laura Wrigley, and Deborah Gross here to talk about some of those strategies to maybe go a little easier on ourselves and to make sure that we know how we can best navigate what we're doing and how to support our kids. So I want to start with Dr. Kronsberg. He's a former public school teacher. His clinical, educational, and research interests focus on providing mental health care outside of the traditional clinic setting. He serves as a psychiatrist for Bayview Medical Center's school-based mental health program in numerous Baltimore City public schools and the Child Mobile Treatment Team. He also serves on Maryland Behavioral Health Integration, on the Maryland Behavioral Health Integration and Pediatric Primary Care's Project ECHO, which aims to educate pediatricians across Maryland on topics and practices related to child and adolescent mental health. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to turn it over to you, Dr. Kronsberg, to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me and the other folks here to get a chance to talk to the community about these really, really critical issues. I actually sent some slides. I don't know if you have them available. I don't really need them, but if they're there,
you should be able to see them.
Okay.
Can you see?
I don't see them, but that's okay. I can still go go on without them.
Okay, so the first one is the screen time in the age of COVID-19, and it should be Hopefully other people can see them, but I'm sharing my screen right now, so we'll see.
Okay, great. Well, I'm just going to dive in. So I guess the first thing that I do want to talk about with respects to screen time, because that's something that lots and lots of parents have been asking about, is to embrace the idea of screens as something that actually have a lot of benefit for our kids, and we can sort of see them as our friends. One of the most important things for kids in managing the stress of something like the stay-at-home orders that we're under, and the COVID crisis more generally, is for them to be able to maintain a connection to their friends and to the communities that they're a part of. This is something that's really helpful for being able to tolerate stress. One of the good things is that kids are actually uniquely able to maintain their social relationships already through technology. They are well practiced at it. So even though maybe in the past we would think about something like Facebook or Instagram and kids being on them for a long time as being something that can be really frustrating, they already know how to connect with friends and maintain their friendships. Obviously, there's no substitute for hanging out with people in person, but this is something that's really useful in helping them to stay connected to the things that are really important to them. On top of that, schools opening virtually is something that's going to be really helpful for kids staying connected to teachers and like I said, important communities, and also working on building skills and growing academically. Finally, kids can use screens to stay in contact with extended family members that they might not otherwise get a chance to see. So we really want to try to use that technology to help foster a sense of the world existing outside of the confines of the house, because that's something that can be really, really hard to experience when we're spending so much time at home. As well, screens can be really useful as learning resources as well. There is a lot of evidence that shows that actually lots of kids, even younger kids, can learn from educational programming and content. And one resource that I would want to point people in the direction of not only the schools, but also the library. And so there's a lot of educational videos, books, and other resources that are available through the Baltimore City Public Library at prattlibrary.org. We can also,
they're doing a lot of great work.
Yeah, it's amazing how many things are out there. I'd only used the library before this as just, a building to go to and rent books or movies or whatever. And I think I've discovered audiobooks and all of these different things that I can now access directly through the internet. So a really nice resource. We can also build new skills and use screens to help us do that. So one of the things that we know about helping kids regulate their emotions is activities that they can engage in where they're building a sense of mastery, helping them get a sense of control over themselves and their own development. YouTube, if someone has done a thing, they have posted it on YouTube. So there are lots of really great instructional videos for anything from like learning a new instrument to gardening to cooking to baking. And that idea of building mastery is really important. And I don't know about you all, but every single one of my friends has decided that they're going to pick up baking bread as a hobby. And so I'm constantly getting pictures of the bread that they're pulling out of the oven. And this is how those sorts of activities where they're gaining a sense of mastery is something that really helps people through a situation where you feel like you don't have much of a sense of control over. And then the last thing that I would want to say about the benefits of screen is that, honestly, just getting through the day is really important. And I know we have oftentimes these very high expectations of ourselves as whether it's employees and parents, and now, our responsibilities through the day in some cases have doubled, tripled, quadrupled. And I think it's really important to recognize that just our kids being occupied so that we can attend to the other things that we need to attend to is really valuable. And I think it's really important for us to be kind of gentle with us about relaxing the sort of rules and expectations that maybe we had in place a lot more rigidly before all of this started. So I do really want to emphasize the idea of, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so being able to give everyone just kind of a break is really valuable.
Yeah.
So on the next set of slides, I do have a handful of the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but a couple of things that are really important to keep in mind, because unlimited screen time can cause issues. So in general, we want people to avoid screen exposure at least an hour before going to bed. There's a lot of evidence that the blue light that emanates from screens is something that can actually kind of communicate to people's brains and bodies that it's time to wake up. There are lots of filters that exist on phones and tablets that can eliminate the blue light, but I think to help facilitate the process of winding down at the end of the evening, an hour before people go to bed is a really good as a bare minimum cutoff point. We do know that excessive use of screen time can lead to eye strain. Ideally, we want people to take about a 10-minute break for every hour that they're on there. And then finally, one thing that was really important and useful is the idea of making what's called a family media plan. And there's a website that I put on the slides on healthychildren.org, which is an organization through the American Academy of Pediatrics that has all kinds of different things that we ought to be thinking of as parents when we are setting rules, parameters, and routines around screen time. So that includes screen-free zones, screen-free times, things like device curfew, media choices, the activities that kids are engaged in when they're not on their screens, online sort of manners and etiquette to help avoid bullying, and also safety and sharing. That's an exhaustive list, and I think a media plan is only useful if it's something that we feel like we can follow and is coherent. So you don't need to necessarily have a very detailed plan for all of those different parameters, but it is useful to, at the very least, think about, how am I going to be paying attention to the sorts of media choices that my kids are engaged in. I do want to talk.
I was going to say, I see the on the next slide, the Kronsberg Family Media Plan. Example.
Oh yes. So I was tinkering with that a little bit just to show you guys what it would look like to go through that process. That's not the actual one. Like, we have a 9-month-old, so she's
hopefully not on screens yet.
She's not yet, but they are in her life. She is talking to grandma and grandpa through the screens. Well, talking is probably a strong word, but she is communicating.
Great.
So I do want to talk a little bit about just kind of best practices to think about with screen time. And, I think a lot of times people are concerned about, okay, how do I prevent kids from getting really, really upset about the screen suddenly being taken away? And I think it's really important to avoid the sort of suddenly taking it away part. So a couple of rules that I think are really valuable. The first is, especially for kids that are playing video games, have a sense of what your kid is playing and how that works. So I have watched more Fortnite than I honestly would care to, but I learned a lot about the game and how it operates. And Fortnite, for instance, is a game that you cannot pause. So it's the sort of thing where if you need something to happen right away and a kid says, I can't stop the game, you just need to wait a couple of minutes. That's because the game doesn't actually allow them to pause it. There are other games that people can play for 48 straight hours and not get bored of it. They can pause it anytime they want. It's not involving other players on the internet. Every game that kids spend a lot of time playing has sort of different ways that they can engage with it. And I think as a parent, it's really helpful to know what those parameters are so that you can set limits around that. So, if your kid is playing Fortnite, for instance, instead of saying, you have to turn this off right away, you can say, at the end of this round, which we can safely assume is going to be somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, the game needs to go off. And you're a lot less likely to experience a kid reacting really strongly. Clear time expectations and schedules are really, really helpful as well. Kids are not going to react. Kids are not going to react as strongly if they know what to expect and if they know how long they're permitted to engage with a game or with a screen. In general, I think we think it's best to use screen time as a reward rather than as a punishment. So like I said, clear expectations to earn screen time, how long that screen time is going to be, and what it's going to take to earn that screen time is really valuable. As a former public school teacher, I can say an oven timer was one of my best friends. You tell the kids, okay, this is going to last for 15 minutes, and they know how much time they have left, and they know when it beeps that the time is effectively over. So again, that clarity is what's really, really important. And there are all sorts of ways that you can sort of manage things throughout the course of the day. So for example, in some families, prefer this route. You know, during a typical school day before all of this happened with the COVID crisis, kids would go to school and they wouldn't be on their screens. There's a lot of time to fill throughout the day though. So some families have relaxed a little bit and said, you know, you can play a little bit during the course of the day. And I think it can be really useful to say, okay, if you're going to get to you know, watch YouTube or hop on a video game during school day time, these are the expectations. The expectation would be doing this amount of schoolwork, being able to connect to your school, maybe doing some amount of chores, having there be conditions for being able to get that. You're a lot more likely to see strong reactions if it's something that's taken away as punishment, especially when that punishment is not what's expected from the sort of parameters that you've already set. Finally, one question that every parent basically asks is how much screen time is too much screen time? And I have good news and bad news. We don't really have a number. The American Academy of Pediatrics does have some recommendations for very young children. Age 2 to 5, the recommendation is about an hour. There's not like a great amount of evidence that would suggest that more than an hour is really harmful or that less than an hour is really helpful. And to be honest, I think a lot of these recommendations should be considered within the context in which they're delivered. So these are pre-COVID recommendations.
Right.
I think the important thing that we need to ask though when we're coming up with how much screen time is too much screen time is, what is the screen time actually replacing? You know, we want to make sure that throughout the course of the day, there's time for exercise, there's time for communicating with families, there's times to sit down and actually eat meals, there's time to engage in schoolwork, and most importantly, there's time for sleep. And if screen time is getting in the way of those things, then I think we can say, yeah, this is probably a bit too much. So, and this is where the idea of screen time being conditional on, you know, being able to do these sets of things can be really helpful. You know, if you can't access the screen until you've done your schoolwork, then you don't have to worry about the screen time taking the place of schoolwork. Last thing I just want to mention is parents, we need limits on screen time too. You know, the news can be on in the background all of the time. We want to watch it to be informed and not terrified. And I will just say, you know, mainstream science reporting can be really, really inaccurate sometimes. So it's important to not have this be sort of a constant buzzing background anxiety generating machine for you and your kids. We want to make sure we practice what we preach. If we're setting limit with kids, we want to abide by them too. And then finally, when we're engaging with our kids, it's really important to make sure that we're fully engaged in that. So we want to turn off our own screens, turn off your email, you know, get off of Facebook or get off of Twitter, and really spend time with your kid at the center of that time. So I'm going to stop raving.
That's great.
And,
no, this is really helpful. The practice what you preach can be hard, but we got to keep trying.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep. Thank you. And now I'm thrilled to have Dr. Laura Wrigley on. She is a clinical psychologist with a broad range of clinical experience working with individuals and families spanning over 20 years. That includes providing child custody evaluations, provision of psychotherapy, as well as cognitive and psychological evaluations. And she currently has a private practice in Mount Washington and a special interest in complex trauma, attachment, relational health, divorce, and grief. In response to COVID, she's partnered with Dr. Laura Kieser to offer an integrative online group offering psychosocial support, meditation, and trauma-based physical therapy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Wrigley. Great to have you. Oh, hold on, let me unmute you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be able to participate in this webinar. And I just want to preface it with an echo from what Hal just talked about, which is that we approach this with a lot of self-compassion because it is a difficult time and it does feel more like a marathon than a sprint. I'd like to use my time to talk a little bit about how the particulars of COVID may be impacting both our and our children's nervous system, and to talk a bit about ways that we can support them and support ourselves so that we move through this with some degree of resilience and emotional balance. So one of the first things I want to mention is that we do have a nervous system that is designed to keep us safe. And one of the things that it likes is predictability. And this has been thrown off. And in many cases, it's been thrown off too quickly and by too much, which can be considered a component of trauma. Too much, too fast. I think for adults, we had a little bit of a sense of seeing this coming, but I know that for a lot of kids, they went to school one day and at the end of the day realized that they were not going back and that their activities were also canceled. It was a little bit of a whiplash emotionally. The other thing about COVID in particular is that it's invisible. It's not a threat that we can locate or see. And when threat can't be located, then our nervous systems move into a bit of a state of hypervigilance. An example would be if you're out for a walk and there's a dog that's barking in an aggressive way. You can hear that, you can see that dog, and you can know when you've moved past it to a place of safety, and that enables our systems to relax a bit. In this case, we don't really have an end in sight, and there's no capacity to locate threat. And COVID is just one of the threats, right? We also have economic concerns. We have lots of other ways that this is layered that can be difficult for both ourselves and our kids. Another thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that there is some grief. There's grief for what our lives looked like before. People are missing their friends and their coworkers, their coaches, their activities. That is something that is real and true and can be dysregulating and difficult to manage. Yeah. On top of these primary losses, we're also missing little micro moments of social connection that are a part of day-to-day regulation. Things like not just our kids' peers, but their parents and their siblings, or familiar faces that are a part of our day-to-day routine. Those are all like moments of contact. And I think we are all struggling with some absence of contact nutrition, which is also important to note. So those are there. And for many of us, and for our kids in particular, the stresses of this may outweigh our resources. And when that happens, then you can see some difficulty in maintaining emotional balance. So the slide that Brooke has up is an example of what we may be seeing and experiencing. We can find ourselves moving out of a comfortable level of arousal, which is where, in this slide, it's the window of tolerance, where you can deal with what's happening, you can focus, you can kind of manage your emotions, and it's a much more comfortable emotional place. When there is prolonged stress or that state of vigilance that I was describing in loss, we can shift into hyper arousal, go down into hypoarousal, or fluctuate between the two. And hypoarousal is, as you can see, it looks more like anxiety. There's feelings of fear, sometimes anger. It's a bit of a fight flight. There may be difficulty sleeping, eating, focusing, sitting still. This isn't really like a choice that we make. This is part of what happens in our nervous systems. Conversely, you can see going into hypoarousal, which is a little bit more what looks like shutting down, numbing, disengagement. You might see in ourselves or our kids a lack of interest engaging with family members or friends, a bit of a numbing that happens. That's also difficult to get out of. And some people are describing to me quite frequently that they find themselves really going from one to the other and having a hard time staying in the middle. So when we notice this with our kids, we want to think about how to help them come back into that place. And this is a nice example. So this model was presented by Dr. Dan Siegel, and it was really designed to help parents cultivate secure connections with their kids. But I think it can also be applied to what we're going through now. And he's great with acronyms, and I actually think it's helpful when we're stressed out to just remember 4 S's. Seeing is really talking about approaching our kids with empathic curiosity, trying to help them have a sense that we have a felt sense of what they may be experiencing. And if we're struggling to discern, that we're going to hang in there with them and help figure that out and name it. For young kids, they might not have the emotional fluency or language. It can just be showing pictures of facial expressions and allowing them to point. For other kids, I've just used like thumbs up, thumb in the middle, thumbs down. Older kids are really good at just naming it. And there is some relief in just being able to sense that there's an empathic person who's there for us. Safe is, can we approach them calmly, validating their feelings, not criticizing them for what they're experiencing, and also having boundaries. That's part of the safety. And then for soothing, it does depend a little bit on where they are in the hierarchy. And there's another slide, Brooke, if we can move to a few resources that I think are helpful. Calm.com has some free meditations that can be helpful and grounding. And that can be a practice that we're doing on a good day. And then that's an available resource to them later. Greater Good Science Center has some great articles about real, like, concrete ways to support ourselves and our kids. Dan Siegel's great. And Kiwi I just put up there because I think that those are, it's a site that really sends kits for kids to build or make things, but they also have resources for educational sites that might be interesting for kids. So one thing that I want to just come back to is that we are social animals, and we are in fact designed to seek support from competent caregivers when there's distress. That can also be regulating. And so things that we can do when we're feeling regulated is to speak to them in a way that's developmentally appropriate about what's happening. Again, help name their feelings, and to let them know that the engagement of social, or I don't like to say physical distancing, is how we're protecting them and how we're protecting other people. One last point, because I think I'm running out of time, is that there can be pressure on parents to get this right all the time. And I know in my own life during stressful periods, I've worried about not being completely regulated and calm enough. But research tells us we really only need to be attuned in that way about 30% of the time for our kids to feel the security that we want them to have. And in fact, the goal when things go offline, which they will because we're humans, is that we come back, we acknowledge it, we work on the relational repair. And that's the kind of relational glue and skill set that I hope helps strengthen our relationships with them, but also strengthens their own relational patterning that will help them now and hopefully help them in the future. And we don't really know what's going to happen, but I know there will continue to be changes and disruptions. So I think that's just a helpful thing to remember. We don't have to get it right all the time, and we can access support. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you so much. And we are going to get to questions that were sent in after this. And if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat box as we go along. And now I'm so pleased to have Deborah Gross. Deborah is best known for her work in promoting positive parent-child relationships and preventing behavior problems in preschool children in under-resourced neighborhoods. At Johns Hopkins, she holds joint appointments at the School of Nursing, the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in the School of Medicine, and the Department of Mental Health in the Bloomberg School of Public Health. She was an associate dean for research and a department chair at Rush University College of Nursing, and there she and her colleagues developed the Chicago Parent Program, which improves parenting behavior and reduces child behavior programs. And I've had the pleasure of knowing her and working with and encouraging this program to grow here in Baltimore City, because I think it's a positive help parents of young kids to work with their kids in a positive way. So thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over for you to you, and then we're going to take questions. So thank you. Hold on, let me.
I think I got myself off. Can you hear me?
Great.
Great.
Yep.
Next slide. So I'm going to try to make this fairly quick because I do want to allow time for slides. And I'm going to be talking about some strategies. If you walk away with one new strategy that you didn't have before, I will call it a win. So the first thing is talk about creating schedules or routines. And you've probably heard this before, but I'm going to just reinforce that probably the most effective way to reduce your stress and your children's stress is to have the days that are predictable. And there's a predictable start to it and a predictable end, which means a bedtime. Not only does it reduce the stress, but it mimics school or childcare, which is really important for kids to have that kind of continuity. And I'm going to show you in the next slide. So why don't you go on to the next one, Brooke? Here's an example. So it doesn't have to look like this, but to give you a sense that when you create your routines, you may talk about this. I'm assuming all of you have created some type of routine or tried to at least, and it's very hard to maintain because it takes a lot of work. But you sort of break out the day into sections, and they are, so I have here like the morning time and all the morning routines, and then the learning if they're in school goes on maybe in the morning, and you want to have blocks of time that are at least an hour long so kids can get into the activity rather than changing from one thing to another. But within those blocks, I also have here different things that kids can choose so that they don't get bored. So you might have after the lunch, the creating, it might also be physical activity. And each day, the kids might just circle which one, or the day before, which thing that they want to focus on for the following day that's in this box of possibilities. But it creates this structure that is consistent. So I'll say no more about routines, but just they're really, really important, but there's flexibility within them too. Next slide. You able to get that? Yeah, okay, great. So I think the thing that parents are struggling, the things that Laura and Hal already talked about are so helpful for managing stress with kids. Here are some of the things about handling your stress about when kids are having meltdowns or they're getting engaged in power struggles, which they're going to do, especially young children, but even the older children will too. And the first thing, and I think Hal alluded to this too, when an activity is going to stop, going to end, to go on to another one, there's going to be a transition. Use 5-minute and 1-minute warnings, especially for young kids who don't have a sense of time. So the more that they can get warned that it's, we're getting to, it's going to be in 5 minutes, it's going to be time to change and go on to this next activity. And then again, at 1 minute, it's going to be time in a minute to change. It helps them to prepare so they don't lash out when they're in the middle of something. The second point is pick your battles. If you can say yes, say yes. This is not the time to decide that you're going to form this child from scratch. The foundation is there, and this is an unusual time. And there may be times where you sort of think about, well, is this a time that we can just say yes and change the rules a little bit? And it's really okay. Just anticipate ahead of time so you don't get caught in the middle of a decision that you have to then undo. Annoying behaviors. Think about those annoying behaviors that you could just use ignore and distract with. And there's a lot of them. There's really not that many behaviors when you think about that you really want to go to the mat for. A lot of them you can just ignore, or you can say, oh, look what we got going on here, and just sort of distract from something else. And the great thing about short attention spans in young kids is distracting them is not hard to do. And it kind of gets them out of that mode where you can see they're getting ready to have a tantrum. The next idea is something called when-thens, which is this is a way to stay out of the power struggle when you've asked your child to do something and they don't do it, which by the way is true of about 99% of all children. And that 1%, there's something wrong with them if they do what you say they're going to do every time you say it. So what you do in this is if you tell the child to do something like clean up their toys and they don't, instead of getting into a power struggle about them, you go off and do something else. And then when they say, is it time, where I can watch cartoons now, or is it time for a snack? And your response is, sure, when you clean up the toys, then it will be time. for the screen or the snack or whatever. End of story. Done. We call that a win-win-win, actually. In addition to the win, then they get something they want and you get something that you want. But again, it's a way to stop these power struggles. You see good behavior, give it your attention. Don't be stingy on this. This is hard for them as it is for you. So when they've given you an hour to work or to do something else, make sure you come back to them and say, I so appreciate that you gave me that time. It was really helpful. Give it your attention and leave it. And finally, for kids who are just really, you know, again, all kids are going to be overwhelmed, but some children are going to be much more sensitive than others to the lack of structure or the change in the structure or the uncertainty of what's going on. Have a comfort area for them. And for example, you know, help them to build a fort with pillows and fill it up with soft, calming objects that they can go to so that when they need to calm down, you can say, do you want to go to your fort? Or do you want to go to the calming pillow or whatever it is? And there's a space for them to go to. And then the last slide is my email, because a lot of the things that you may have are just, you know, very much more specific, and I'm really happy to take your email. And that's it for me.
That's great. That's very helpful. Thank you. These were all very helpful, a lot of good information. So we had a number of people send in some questions. The first question Hal talked a little bit about already. So how much screen time is too much? So thank you for addressing that. There's no sort of hard and fast rules. One question is our 9-year-old went from having limited screen time pre-pandemic to the unmonitored screen time while learning virtually on their own device with both parents working remotely and 5-year-old sibling requiring frequent assistance to navigate virtual kindergarten. This has resulted in 9-year-old skipping assignments, doing the bare minimum, cruising around on YouTube. We're talking about integrity and doing the right thing when no one is looking, but how do we balance, how do you help a child to sort of the newfound freedom on a device and stay on track, sort of internal motivation without just locking everything down? Any advice on that and walking that line?
So I think that's a really, really good question. And it speaks to how challenging this moment is for so many families. Kids all of a sudden have so much more freedom now than they had 2 months ago when it comes to using electronics unmonitored. And honestly, I don't know that I have like a very clear, straightforward kind of answer. But I do think that there is such a thing as too much freedom for kids. And I think asking 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, even 13, 14, 15-year-olds to act completely responsibly with screens is maybe asking a bit too much for them to go to their room and do exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So one thing that can be helpful is, you know, is it possible for the kid just to do schoolwork or something like that in the same room as a parent? Is there an opportunity for parents to just check in and say, hey, I just want to know what you've been up to for the last hour or two? The extent to which we can stay connected with our kids, even if it's just brief check-ins that are spread throughout the course of the day, I think can go pretty far and also help a kid feel like that there are limits that are placed on them, that someone is watching them, that they do feel a little bit contained, even if it's not, you don't have a ton of time, even if these are just brief sort of check-ins that can be scheduled throughout the day. Yeah,
that makes sense. That makes sense. Folks asked for some tips on minimizing parent burnout and how can parents best balance priorities of school, telework, parenting to support emotional well-being of themselves and their children, you know, how to manage and choose not to react to your child in your anger while stuck at home. So really just how can we make sure that we're also supporting ourselves during this really difficult time to minimize our burnout, because then of course we end up taking it out on our kids, which isn't good. And I'm guilty of that too. So would love to hear thoughts and ideas about that. Thank you.
So I don't know if Laura, you wanted to take that one or you want me to?
You can both have go for it. You want to start? And
you have to create time for yourself as a parent, and just build it into the routine, into the schedule. If there's another adult that you're fortunate to have in the home, work out an arrangement with that other adult so that you each have time to yourself, to calm. And then there's other helpful, stress reduction techniques. And I think Laura probably has a lot of suggestions on like in the moment stress reduction techniques too. Did you want to talk about that, Laura?
Sure. Yeah, I agree with you that I think there is a need to remember self-care, and that for a lot of us right now, there's so much of a need for our attention and energy to go out because we are trying to work and co-parent, and that is important. I like to think about the model of the practice of attention going out and then attention going back in and then going out and back in. And if there's a way to take an hour a day to yourself, that's great. If that's not available, sometimes 5 minutes of a breather can be helpful. I know sometimes if I just take a second to breathe, I put my hand right here. It brings like a little mindfulness back into the body. And it also can sort of activate a little bit of oxytocin that can be regulating. And that's just a quick hack to try to bring ourselves back. It's okay also to let our kids know that I'm having a hard time being available right now in the way you need me, and I'm going to take a minute and I'm going to come back, and then I'll be available in the way that we both need. That's okay. Other things too, yeah, just to add in, taking a walk if you can, getting in nature is great, making sure that we are in touch with people who are emotionally supportive. And, with screens, I've had people talk to me about they need to get something done, they don't feel resourced for it. So calling a close friend or a relative who can just kind of step in and tag team even from a distance. So remembering our resources can be important. Yeah, I could go on forever on this one, but I'll let it go.
No, that's helpful. Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. There were several about how to talk to our children about the pandemic and about while we're doing this without scaring them. And of course, it depends the age, what doesn't, but if you have any thoughts on that, would love to hear them.
I just want to throw in, I'm sorry, and then CNN did a nice kids summit on Saturday, I think, which for younger kids, if it's still available, it is a nice opportunity to kind of hear languaging around it and hear other kids' questions. So that's a resource to keep in mind.
Yeah.
The other suggestion I would make is for young kids, make it very simple. So it's like, how when people get a really bad cold, you stay home. Now, lots of people have really bad colds, so we're all going to help them out and stay home and make it really simple. And if older children, find out but if they ask you a question, find out what they know first so that your answer doesn't go beyond what they're actually prepared to process, and it actually might be much simpler. And the last thing, please keep in mind, the majority of people who get COVID-19 have minimal symptoms. So just keep remembering that all the things that you're doing by the physical distancing and the hand washing and the coughing into your sleeve, all of that is going to really reduce the likelihood you're going to get sick, and really remind your children of that.
That's helpful. There were some people who talked about that, going outside, and I think one of you mentioned can be really helpful, and it's good to get outside and the importance of it. But a couple people wrote in and said that they had children who used to like to go outside, but now seem anxious or don't want to go outside, don't want to leave the home. Any thoughts on how to talk to your kids about that?
So I think when kids are really anxious, one of the ways that I sort of describe the impact that it has on them is their universe starts to shrink. There's more and more things that they avoid, and they spend more and more time doing the things that they feel most comfortable in. I think we know, there are so many different benefits that can be experienced from getting outside, whether it's exercise, just exposure to sunlight, that can help kids with emotion regulation. I think opening the door and pushing your kids out the front door is not going to be a way to solve that issue, though. And trying to find some sort of middle ground. They may be anxious about going outside when there are lots of people. You know, is there a way that you can have a conversation with them to say, okay, maybe we can go for a family walk as soon as we wake up in the morning when there are a lot fewer people that are out on the street, and trying to make sure that their universe doesn't get too constricted, because the more constricted it gets, the harder it is, both when things normalize, but even now in the moment, it is to spend time in the things that give you a little bit of discomfort. So I do think trying to very gently push our kids to spend time outside, getting some exercise, but in doing it in a way that is also compassionate about what their worries are specifically. And as Deb and Laura had both mentioned, I think education is a really important part of it. Some kids may have lots of misconceptions about going outside and how they might be able to contract the virus. And I think correcting some of those misconceptions can help reduce some of that anxiety as well.
That makes sense. A couple questions in the chat that I want to get to too. One was, I like the recommendation ignoring annoying behavior when you end in a multi-kid household where one kid does something that the other kid, so the parents can ignore the annoying behavior, the other child can't. So one is doing annoying behavior and the other child crying or screaming. That's a good one. And then also the emphasis, another person also enjoyed your emphasis on keeping things positive. Could you talk more about messages children might be getting if they receive too much negative feedback? Is it ever appropriate to use a more strict or negative tone, or when is it appropriate to use strict or negative tone?
Well, let me answer the first question first about what do you do when you've got multiple children and they're all being annoying, which is really common. The one thing is to distract. So for example, if you happen to be so lucky as to have a child who's having a tantrum and the other child is not yet having a tantrum, and immediately turn your attention to the child that's behaving well and going, I'm so thankful that you're hanging in there with me. You know, why don't we go do something fun, and maybe when he's done, he'll come join us. So what you want to do is give all of your attention to the kid who's behaving positively, even if it's just for that moment. And then they get the idea that the kid who's behaving is going to get more of your attention. That's the hard part, when they're both competing for your attention in negative ways. Does that make sense? I don't know if I answered that question about, and the second one?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Yep, I think the second one was about, let me see, pull it back up, was when is it ever appropriate to use sort of more strict and negative language than the sort of ignoring and more positive language?
So think about what are the behaviors that are ignorable and what is not ignorable. Just anticipate it ahead of time. So obviously things that are destructive, that are unsafe, that are harmful cannot be ignored. That's pretty much a small number of the behaviors. The rest are kind of, obnoxious, and they can be ignorable. And what happens is the kids are so used to you giving a lot of your attention that when they're really feeling like they're not getting enough of your attention, which is a lot of what kids are going through right now because we're all preoccupied, they tend to use it more. And so I would say, just in your head, have, okay, if he does this, I can ignore it. If he does this, I can't ignore it, and just systematically do it each time. And use distract. As soon as they stop doing the behavior that's annoying, then go, let's go do something else, and then immediately distract them. But the negative, I just follow up by saying, the negative is really going to go downhill quickly if you rely on it too heavily.
That's helpful. And how, a couple questions about preparing to go back. So for reopening, and, our children who are used to us being home now 24 hours a day, I have never had as many family dinners like in either of my children's lives as I have now. Usually I'm out at community meetings and other parents are doing evening activities or aren't home in the morning or during the day or for lunch. And, any thoughts on when we do reopen or preparing kids now, for us going to summer camp, or that things are going to go back to normal and what that means? Any thoughts on that?
I do think it's going to be an adjustment when things go back to, whatever normal is going to look like, and our habits change again. And I would just come back to being really present with our kids about how they're feeling about all of those changes, and validating that it is hard. And there may be some pushback. There may be some kids who are sad to be losing as much time with their parents as they've had before. So I sort of come back to the model of being responsive and acknowledging what they're going through and kind of standing beside them in that, while also encouraging them. And then just a tone of voice, I just want to touch on that. I think it's really impossible to parent and never have a negative tone. I think it's just going to happen. There is a significance to the tone that we want to try to use that helps them to be able to take in a correction and information. And when we're angry and we're yelling, they're probably not going to be able to integrate the message. But it's going to happen. Yeah.
That's helpful.
You can also go backwards if you realize that you've not handled the situation in the best way. Go back and model for the child. You know, I was really thinking about that. And I wish I hadn't handled it this way. This is what I really would have wanted to say about it. And that's a great model for kids.
Yeah.
That's helpful. I definitely snapped at one of my kids yesterday, and then I went back and apologized because I felt bad. So this has been super helpful. I want to be respectful of people's time. There was one question that I really appreciated that was emailed in, and I thought maybe we could end with that. And of course, I'm going to share the screen again as we end so that people have your contact information. But that question was, what is the most effective way to show your child you love them? Love to hear your thoughts on that.
The most effective way to show your child you love them?
Yes. Ideas for in this crazy time showing them.
Your time, just being with them and being really with them. That shows that that behavior is very loving and very nurturing and really important to children.
Any final comments on that or other points that you all would like to make?
I would just echo, it's our presence. And when our presence can be attuned and responsive, that is a beautiful way to show our love.
I would just echo those statements. I thought very well, very nicely put.
Great. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for joining me today. This was incredibly helpful. Tons of great substantive ideas and solutions. And I always try to end these with a note of gratitude. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to all of you who are out there, who are sharing this information and these ideas. And thank you, of course, to our essential workers, because we are home in our spaces right now and we have the luxury to be here. But there are many people who don't have that luxury and they're out, driving buses or working at grocery stores or working in our hospitals, and to all of our state workers, really grateful to them. And we're actually going to have a webinar tomorrow at noon with a number of people who represent folks who are on the front line. So I'm to celebrate International Workers Day and to lift up the work that they're doing. So you can join us then. We're all in this together. And I know if we want to, that we will emerge stronger than before. So thank you so much to everybody. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and feel free, please keep in touch, stay safe, be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.